Neurological trauma on a widespread scale is the root cause of much of Milwaukee's unemployment, mental illness, addiction, alcoholism, suicide, and homelessness, according to public health researchers. It was just over a year ago that Scaling Wellness in Milwaukee, or SWIM, hosted its first trauma-informed care conference, bringing together over 1,000 participants to discuss the long-lasting and systemic impact trauma has on individuals and communities. So SWIM's vision is, quote, a connected trauma-responsive community where all can thrive. Today we will hear from Mike Lovell, co-founder of SWIM, and Tim Grove, senior consultant at St. A, on the science behind trauma-informed care and solutions for incorporating this successful method into the workplace. So I'd now like to introduce our speakers. So Dr. Michael Lovell, well known to our community, is Marquette University's 24th president, serving since 2014. Under his guidance, Marquette focuses on innovation, entrepreneurship, and community renewal and development. Working with business and community leaders in Marquette's neighborhood, President Lovell helped create the Near West Side Partners, a nonprofit focused on strengthening economic development, housing, and neighborhood identity and safety. He and his wife, Amy, founded Scaleness in Milwaukee, a community-wide effort addressing impacts of generational trauma. President Lovell serves as co-chair of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation's Milwaukee Succeeds initiative and co-chairs the GMC's Innovation and Talent Committee that I just reported on. He also serves on the boards of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, Big East Conference, and Children's Hospital of Wisconsin. He's a member of the Council on Competitiveness and serves on executive committees of the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, Greater Milwaukee Committee, the Water Council, and Wisconsin Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, for which he's the chair. He's a busy person, and he's educating hundreds, if not thousands, in our community. So thank you very much, Mike Lovell. Tim Grove is a senior consultant at St. A human services agency whose mission is to facilitate equity, learning, healing, and wellness for all. He has more than 20 years of professional experience in a variety of direct care and administrative positions, including in-home services, foster care, treatment, foster care, residential treatment, child welfare, community-based services, quality improvement, and staff development. A very broad experience. Tim Grove is the senior leader of trauma-informed care initiatives across all agency programs and was responsible for implementing St. A's trauma-informed care philosophy and practices, including Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of therapeutics. So maybe he's going to tell us what that means. He created a trauma-informed care training curriculum centered on the 7 essential ingredients of understanding and practicing trauma-informed care. Grove and the training team at St. A have used this framework to train more than 50,000 people from diverse disciplines over the past 10 years. It's also a very deep experience. Tim Grove is recognized nationally as a trauma-informed care expert and was recently interviewed by Oprah Winfrey for a 60-minute segment on trauma and resilience. So following their presentation, then we'll hear from a panel who are incorporating trauma-informed care in their workplace and the impact it is having on their staff, their business, and the community. So this trauma-informed care is a new practice across the nation, and these panelists have developed the curriculum and playbook for how to incorporate it into the workplace. So let me just quickly introduce the panelists, and then we'll get going here. So Frank Cumberbatch from Bader Philanthropies. Frank, welcome. And he's on the steering committee for SWIM. Alicia Dupreez from Capri Communities. Alicia, pleased to see you here. Bill Harrigan from Harrigan Solutions. Bill Krugler from Milwaukee Jobs Work. And Ralph Metzner from FEI. So following the panelists then, Greg Marcus will be wrapping up the meeting, but please, Mike Lovell, if you would come up here. So join me in welcoming Mike.
Well, thanks a lot, David. I really appreciate all of you being here today to talk about an initiative that is kind of very near and dear to my heart. And the first thing I want to do is just set a little bit of context about why this effort matters, why SWIM matters, and particularly to me, and why I think it should matter to you. Now, I just left an executive committee meeting of the Greater Milwaukee Committee upstairs to come down here. And one of the missions of the Greater Milwaukee Committee is to make Milwaukee the best city to live, learn, work, stay, and play. And I'll repeat that. The GMC, one of our missions, is to make Milwaukee the best city to live, learn, work, stay, and play. And I will contend that if we don't address the trauma that this city faces, we will never achieve that mission. And you know, I'm kind of new to the game with trauma. You're going to hear from Tim, who's had more than a decade experience in this. But as I've come to realize the impact of trauma, particularly generational trauma, on our city, you will realize that we will never reach our potential. You know, I think about some of the great disparities that we have around workforce, education, healthcare, our criminal justice system. The list will go on and on. Trauma is at the root cause of many of those disparities. And so when we think about really what SWIM is all about, it's really two things that we want to try to get to. And first of all, we need to help people heal from trauma. People in our city have experienced trauma for decades. We need to try to help them heal. Second is we need to minimize the trauma that citizens of our city experience. It's really a two-headed monster that we need to slay. And so as I think about how we can do that, it's only through collaboration. It's going to take all of us working together because this is a really big problem that's been in our city for a long time. And just so you know, from a personal viewpoint, another reason why I'm passionate about this is, you know, I've come to learn that, you know, trauma impacts almost everyone. As Tim's going to go through the ACE study in a second, at least 1 in 2 of us has had trauma as a child, had an adverse child experience. And so, you know, I personally had a score of 5, which meant my likelihood of being successful in life is very low. But I was blessed to grow up in a small town where I had buffering adults. I had teachers, I had people at our church, I had friends, parents. When my own family unit maybe broke down, others invested in me and helped me be successful. And I'm interested in helping everyone in the city of Milwaukee achieve the success that they can achieve. And I know that there are parts of the city that don't have those buffering adults that I had that helped me be successful when I had some challenging times. So in many ways, I feel blessed. And so I just finally want to end up, and you'll probably hear from some of our panelists about this, that addressing this problem is not going to be easy. It's actually going to be really hard. And first of all, it's because it's been happening for generations. And it really, some of the things that it gets to the core of are things like race and segregation, inequities in access to resources that our city has. And to address these things, you have to change systems. And that's the hardest thing to change within a city, because systems are big, they're large. There's not one focal point to address. It actually takes a lot of sustained effort to start to change systems. And so as we think about what SWIM is and what it's about, I will just contend that I hope all of you can kind of think about how you can get behind what we're trying to do. Because again, if we are going to like you, I love Milwaukee, and I want Milwaukee to reach its potential. And unless we can change things to make trauma something that we help people heal from and we can eliminate, we are just not going to be the city we want to be. And so I'm going to show a video here that really outlines, how we started and where we've come. And this was a great video put together last February by the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. So go ahead and play that.
Trauma or these stresses cut horizontally through every issue, every class, every race, every demographic in society. Trauma affects.
So as Frank alluded to, we're in the process of moving towards forming our own nonprofit, an entity which will become SWIM. And for that,
accomplished that there's a lot of great grassroots organizations doing this work, and we need to identify them and be the win.
We had a panel of experts from all different disciplines talking about the disparities, and the root cause that they all mentioned was trauma. If we wanted to address the disparities and really, make our city healthier and promote healing, we had to address that trauma. And so after that event, we just called together anyone who was there to come back to talk about what we could do. And we started a year ago last January with about 30 people.
The work is out there for us to do. We need to do the work, but we can't do it by ourselves. We collectively need to do it together.
One of the things that we really need to focus on and work on is getting more of the community involved and the community voice at the table.
We know what the issues are. We know what the solutions are. Let's just get to work.
There's misconceptions that we're somehow saying we have the answers and here's this new thing that is going to solve all the problems. That's not at all SWIM's intention at all. It's to connect people and to be that catalyst and to help scale things
together, because we're definitely more stronger together than we are apart.
Milwaukee is unfortunately known for things that we're not proud of. The most segregated city in the nation, high levels of incarceration. These are things that an understanding of trauma and appreciation for how to help heal can impact in a positive way.
SWIM I think is an important effort for our community because it brings together people who are concerned about trauma, not just on an individual level, but also on a community level, and the impact that trauma has on children, on families, and on neighborhoods. We have to come together across racial lines, across geographic lines, and understand that trauma that impacts any segment of this community impacts all of the community.
I know a lot of y'all have heard about 53206. We talk about it all the time, but 53206 is the whole city is 53206. And we are not addressing the root causes of why we have a zip code that is the most incarcerated, most centralized poverty.
And so the more that we can come together across professions, across different disciplines, to really look at how do we prevent trauma on the front end, and then also how do we provide opportunities for healing and resilience on the back end is critically important.
We have to lift the entire boat. Right, so those who have cannot say it is not my problem. It's all of us, all, the collective, have to first acknowledge. It's like the 12-step program, right? Raise your hand and admit you have a problem. And then let's all rally around what do we do to fix this problem.
And we are taking back the narrative to show people the beauty in Milwaukee. I don't care how much negativity comes from this city. Like, I could never leave. I've left this city 3 times. and I've always come back here.
We have to all work together, and everybody has different experiences to bring to it.
And so part of what we do is we raise awareness around, first of all, what some of the challenges are, related to trauma in our city, and then awareness of some of the great things that are already happening.
Swim is open to anyone. It is a community collaborative.
I think we really could achieve what Mike and Amy Lovell want, which is to make Milwaukee the most trauma-informed city in the United States, and I really believe we can do that. But then we have to match that with well-trained professionals, that when you do experience trauma, that we have the proper care. We have an infrastructure set up for you to be healed. That is what I think will set us apart from other cities around the nation, is that infrastructure. And that's what it's all about, is creating that infrastructure which will sit on a bed of technology that allows a person, once you recognize that there's something fundamentally wrong here, that you could enter the system in any place and that you will get access to the healing as quickly as possible.
She was speaking the language of what we hope to accomplish.
I feel like swim is early in its journey, and so I think people are at least committed to taking that journey together, and I think we can define collectively where that journey goes. But I think everyone agrees that as a community, we can do better to prevent trauma. And so the more that we can come together and remain committed to this cause, the better.
So one of the things that was mentioned in the video was we want to become trauma-informed as a city. And one of the great things that has happened over the last decade is we've learned a lot more about the brain science and what happens to us when we're traumatized, and then how we can heal from that. And we are blessed to have an expert today, Tim Grove, to come up and tell us a little about the science, and hopefully he won't confuse us too much by getting too deep into the details. But we certainly should be very thankful we have an organization like St. A's in Milwaukee.
Thank you, Mike. So Mike gives you fair warning for good purpose. We've condensed about a semester's worth of a doctoral level program into 10 minutes, so hang on to your hats. It'll probably go fairly quickly, but we've tried to distill this down to the basic information. And what I want you all to know is the science I'm going to present to you has been published in over 100 different journals. There is probably no such thing as perfect science, but this is really, really good science that is the fundamental anchor for what you've heard so far. The other thing I would just say very briefly is I'm always amazed at how small Milwaukee is, and in many ways how cohesive Milwaukee can be. I see some of our St. A board members here who are also connected to the Greater Milwaukee Committee, Mary, Jackie, and James. I also see some of our philanthropic partners who have supported this work throughout the years. It's nice to be in good company. So here goes the quick blast of science. A discovery, frankly, by accident. A curious clinician in San Diego, California, trying to figure out why patients in an obesity study who were successfully losing weight kept leaving the study. And his curiosity, this is Vince Folletti, led him to say something else must be going on. And he discovered by accident, when one of his patients talked about a childhood sexual abuse history, a patient who had gained, oh, by the way, after losing about 120 pounds, 37 pounds in 3 weeks, got her doctor saying something else must be going on there, something much more fundamental. You've heard the word root cause quite a bit. So he brings in the CDC and designs a survey of 10 really simple questions, asking adults, and in this case in California 17,000 plus adults, to answer yes or no to each of those 10 questions. And when you answer yes to one, you tally up your total number of yes answers and you get what's commonly called an ACE score. One of the things that startled both Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti, Dr. Anda was the CDC partner who came in to help design the survey, was frankly just how common middle-class adults receiving health care through Kaiser Permanente reported adversity. So here are the breakdowns on the screen, including 27% of those adults reporting significant substance abuse or misuse in their household growing up, 28% reporting physical abuse, 21% reporting sexual abuse. So across those 17,000 people, that's the percentage of folks that said yes to one of those 10 questions. The other thing that struck them and caught them off guard, quite frankly, was how often people said yes to more than one question. So here's a breakdown of data from that same study, 17,000 folks, with percentages that said yes to 0 questions of those 10, percentages that said yes to 1, 2, 3, and then 4 or more. 16% of a mostly middle to upper class white demographic in San Diego, California, said yes to 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. When you hear Dr. Folletti and Dr. Anda talk about this, they were frankly blown away. Dr. Folletti will tell stories in his obesity clinic of 55% of his cohort reporting childhood sexual abuse, more than half. In the medical establishment, this was the beginning, really, of social and emotional determinants of health. The second big theme, though, with ACEs that is really important to understand if we're going to sort of have common language and understanding around the science, was what potentially takes place from a physical and emotional health point of view with high ACE scores. So here is a graph showing you ACE scores and depression broken down by gender. The general rule of thumb here is what we call sort of a staircase effect, or the percentage of folks struggling with depression with an ACE score of 0, just under 20 when we're talking about women. And when you get to ACE scores of 4 or more, that number triples to 60. You see a similar sort of staircase effect in men. And I could literally show you about 70 graphs. This is but a sampling of graphs I could show you that would have the exact same visual effect. But let me give you a little data because sometimes the effect is pretty pronounced. Heart disease and cancer. An ACE score of 4 or more compared to an ACE score of 0 carries double the risk. Suicide, an ACE score of 4 or more compared to an ACE score of 0, 12 times the risk. IV drug use, an ACE score of 6 or more compared to an ACE score of 0, 46 times the risk. You can imagine how the researchers, upon seeing this data, said, can this be real? Is this possibly true? Where across most of the challenges we face as communities, you've got both a curse and I would quite frankly argue a bit of a gift. You hear us use the word root cause quite a bit. So the theory is addressing ACEs, healing, preventing ACEs, thereby then has positive effect on everything on this list. More on that a little bit later. How do we get from adverse childhood experiences to trauma and then trauma-informed care? You heard Dr. Lovell talk about the support of neighbors and community. When we're talking about kids especially experiencing adversity, the real question is, do adults see it, recognize it, and respond appropriately? And when they do, they can create marvelous stories amidst that adversity of people doing remarkable things. When they don't, all other things being equal, you have a high risk of that adversity becoming trauma. For that reason, not all adversities become trauma, and one of the biggest difference makers is what we do as the people in the communities around the folks we're concerned about. How do we recognize it? How do we see it? How do we promote this thing you're going to hear more about from our panel called trauma-informed care? And so here's the good news about SWIM. A number of agencies in your community have been doing this work for quite a while, and SWIM had this remarkably noble goal of trying to bring those efforts together, weave in connective tissue or thread, and sort of, to Amy Lovell's favorite quote, be the wind behind their sails, right? So let me give you an example of some of this activity that you may or may not know about. About 6 months ago, I got a call from an old colleague who used to work for the public health department in Milwaukee. 8 years prior, we had done some training for her and her colleagues around the science of stress, adversity, and trauma, and she was now in charge of a public health department on the south shore of our county. She got some money from the Department of Health Services to address opioids in the South Shore communities of Cudahy, St. Francis, Oak Creek, and South Milwaukee. And she said to me, Tim, I know that if we're going to address the opioid epidemic, we have to co-prioritize addressing stress and trauma. So we want to figure out a way to teach all of our first responders in those 4 communities what it means to be trauma-informed. Can you help? It's going to be a grand experiment in those communities to see whether or not that intervention does indeed over time address the opioid epidemic. And I could literally step down from this stage and bring up 50, 100, 150 colleagues and partners who could share similar stories around what the work looks like in Milwaukee. And I think collectively we would say we are so excited to sort of have SWIM continue to be that connective tissue that supports that work. I think that might have been less than 10 minutes. Science hopefully relatively clear. I didn't overwhelm anybody, right? So I'm going to ask Dr. Lovell to come back up and talk a little bit about what SWIM is doing in Milwaukee to promote and sort of reinforce this work.
Well, thanks, Tim. That was a remarkable 10 minutes of trauma. But we will have questions. We'll have questions at the end that you could address to Tim directly if you want to understand more. So, you know, when people ask what SWIM is, it's really just a movement. You know, we started about 18 months ago after an event at Marquette University around disparities in our city, where we just invited everybody to come back, and we had about 30 individuals at that very first meeting. And what's happened since that meeting? Well, we've been meeting every 6 months, now we're meeting every quarter. And now we have almost 800 individuals from 500 organizations that, you know, have been coming to our meetings and being part of this. And the great thing about it is people are coming because they want to, not coming because they have to. People are passionate about addressing trauma and the things that are happening in our city. And we're blessed to have 9 steering committee members that represent some great organizations in our city. You can see we have Frank from Bader, we have Bob Duncan from Children's, we have myself, we have Amy from RegGen, we have Julia Taylor from the GMC, we have Grady Cosby from Johnson Controls, we have John Lehrman from Medical Wisconsin, and we have Reggie Moore from the Office of Violence Protection. And so we have that group is helping kind of, you know, define and help us lead where we're going. But really, this is just something that has continued to grow. And as you heard earlier, we did have a conference last year in September where we had about 1,200 people come and hear national experts talk. We've gotten so big at the meetings in the organization is now we've broken into subgroups. So we have 8 different action teams that are working at different aspects of the trauma. And these groups now are establishing their own mission. They're meeting, at least every month, and setting their own agenda about ways that they can help address this very, very large program that our city's facing. And I won't go through all of them, but just the idea is when you start getting 500, 600, 700 people involved in something, obviously you can't do everything in one room together. You have to have smaller groups meeting together. And one of the great things we're going to talk about today is the work that our corporate engagement group is doing in ways that they are really trying to help corporations and people in the workplace, be trauma-informed and address trauma that their employees may be facing. So again, the Corporate Engagement Action Team, they really are focusing on giving leaders the resources they need to help their workforce and to help develop a workforce that'll be more successful. You can see on the graph, ACEs and unemployment and chronic absenteeism in employees, as the ACE score goes up, obviously showing the same curves that Tim showed a second ago. The data just shows the more ACEs someone has, the more challenges they have being good employees. And so obviously, one of the great things that we have with St. A and others, we've developed a trauma-informed training. And what we're really encouraging, all of you, hopefully you all leave today, hopefully you're more trauma-informed and understand some of the challenges we're facing in the community. And we'd like you to try to find a way to engage. And you don't necessarily have to come to swim meetings, but be engaged. 7 people from the organization to the conference, some people from the organization to the training, which I'm going to show in a second, some of the dates and things. But we really believe that the best and very most important first step in addressing this problem is awareness. And then once we have the awareness, then we develop the tools and the ways we can collaborate to work together. So talking about tools, on October 30th with MRA, there's a training program called Creating Workforce Resilience. And you can go to MRA's website. This is prominently shown. But I would encourage you to have your HR directors or others that may be interested within your workplace, come to this just to get a better understanding, because, a lot of times when we have workers that are facing challenges, the question we need to be asking is not what's wrong with them, but what happened to them. And if we understand what's happening to them and the traumas they may currently be facing or formerly faced, maybe we can get them the help they need so that they can be better employees. And then finally, I do want to invite all of you to our next annual conference, our second annual conference, is October 7th to 8th in Wisconsin Center District. We're very, very pleased this year. We're partnering this year with SDC, who annually has had a poverty conference. So we have this joint summit. I would just say that George Hinton has been just a remarkable partner with us, in terms of planning this. We have 4 keynote speakers coming that are all national level experts in their field. So I do want to encourage you or other people within your organization. It is well worthwhile. I can just tell you how much I've learned last year at the summit. I know now just enough about brain science to be a little bit dangerous because of the experts we had in, but really things around implicit bias we had last year, it helped me look at the world in a different way and understanding the way maybe I should be interacting with individuals within our community to really help if I want to make positive change. And so with that being said, I do want to now bring up our panel of experts, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion and talk back about ways that trauma-informed care can be implemented in your workforce and things we can do. So maybe what I thought maybe I may want to do is just spend a minute or two just having each of the panelists kind of introduce themselves and briefly talk about the organization and why you're passionate about this. Yeah.
My name is Ralph Metzner. I'm with an organization called FEI Workforce Resilience. We're a social enterprise wholly owned by the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities. We are extremely passionate about helping organizations become trauma-informed and trauma-responsive. Because in our experience that we've had already, we've been able to see that these ideas and the techniques that come from them will go a long way towards destigmatizing mental health in the workplace and making all employees more productive and engaged.
I'm Frank Cumberbatch. I'm the Vice President for Engagement at Bader Philanthropies.
I took a job with the mayor of Milwaukee a few years ago and was put on a job training program. And I often wondered, since I got that opportunity, why is it that black males, which what the program is for, couldn't keep a job? And in doing the work, I found out that it took millions of dollars to train welders in the city of Milwaukee. And in that program, 1 out of 50 graduated. No one could convince me that black men don't know how to work. Been working our entire lives. And I knew there had to be some underlying problem as to why they couldn't make it through that program. And when Mike and Amy asked me to join SWIM, I recognized that this very well could be the answer to that question.
I feel like this is down so far. There we go. I'm Alicia Dupies. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Growth for Capri Senior Communities. And so we serve 2,100 residents throughout southeast Wisconsin, senior residents, our very most vulnerable population. And one of the things that is an obstacle for us is our caregiver staff and keeping them engaged and happy and healthy, and keeping them on staff. You know, historically, the caregiver position, whether you're in hospital or a healthcare setting or a senior living setting, sees anywhere from 50 to 80% turnover. And so we said, how do we get at that turnover? How do we reduce that turnover? And I'll talk a little bit later about a caregiver focus group study that we did this last fall, where we learned our caregivers said, we would stay with you, you know, in perpetuity if we had better support, if we had a better boss who understood not what's the matter with me, but, you know, what's going on with you and how can we help? And so with Tim Grove's help, on Wednesday, we will pilot, as part of the Corporate Engagement Committee, as part of SWIM, the first workforce, trauma-informed workforce training here in Milwaukee. And we'll do that with 33 of our managers who supervise these employees.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Krugler. I am the president and founder of a nonprofit called Milwaukee Jobs Work, which I started about 6.5 years ago after spending 30 plus years in the business community in Milwaukee. And I started it because I was very troubled by the level of poverty that we have in our city. At that time, we were the 4th most impoverished city in the United States. And I started to probe with the business community that I was part of, you know, what could we do about it? And what I found out from the business community, they were so frustrated with they had tried to hire people from the city and just were very frustrated, had a terrible experience with it. And so I tried to put together a program that was to help these hardest to employ individuals and close the gap to be able to prepare them and connect them to sustainable employment at your companies and have them be good employees that show up every day with the right attitude and work hard. One of the things that we do that's different than most traditional workforce development programs is that we go much deeper with the individuals that we serve. We really need to understand all the issues and challenges and obstacles they're facing in their life that are keeping them from being the good employees that you want them to be. And so we dig very deeply, and trauma is one of the huge issues that we face, that the people that we work with are facing, that are keeping them from being successful. So we work with them to identify the barriers. We work with them then to put together a plan to connect them to the right resources that are going to allow them to overcome those barriers so that they can end up with that sustainable employment that helps them achieve their goal of achieving economic self-sufficiency.
So I don't think that's on, is it? Something I have to do here? Oh, it is on. Okay, my name is Bill Harrigan from Harrigan Solutions. Dave Stern is my business partner. And the reason I'm here is that I grew up in trauma, and I sort of understand this from the underside. And we've together built a business model around how do we take the most difficult population, and that would be of ex-offenders, and bring them on and make them part of very, very high performance teams. And so we do work we do sanitation work, we do, Dave? We do food plants, excuse me, and we also do work at manufacturing plants. And so our teams operate about 35% more efficient than any other team around. They're highly efficient teams, and almost every one of them is an ex-offender. So we've just built a system around how to bring people in and treat them in a way that respects them and makes them part of the business and helps them deal with the obstacles they have.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. And so if I'm, in the audience today, and I've seen the data that Tim just presented, I realize that there is a high percentage of my workforce that has experienced trauma, in their lives. And so I guess the first question is, I think, maybe wondering, well, first of all, as an employer, how do I recognize which my employees, have experienced trauma and may need help? And then where in the organization do we need to go, or do we need to provide support and tools to help those individuals be more successful? So anyone can answer that one. Okay.
So as part of our caregiver focus group study, we learned firsthand from our caregivers. We took 22 caregivers from multiple locations. Some had been with us, as short as 6 months. Some had been with us for 30 years, across all ages, race, gender, et cetera. And we kind of asked empirically, we used some of Tim's ACE questionnaire to understand what our ACE scores might be looking like. And I'd say the average that day with that group was, 3.5 if we had to use a scientific average, Tim. And so that's when we knew that we had something that we could, that we could go on and that we could work with our supervisors to try to start to address. So the first step will be this week in terms of awareness and understanding. But Tim has already given us some, kind of tools. How do we build resilience? How do we help our caregivers reduce stress? One of our communities right now is allowing our caregivers every hour on the hour to go kind of walk and just, kind of reduce their stress. And so these will take, these changes will take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is a collective team effort. It's happening from our CEO level and down. And so I think that we feel really optimistic that it's something that will get, will get its wings, but it will certainly take some time.
If I could add, I think it starts with you in this room. You're all leaders in your own corporations or organizations. This is a great start today, to learn to understand how do you identify trauma. But you have to examine your policies at your corporation. Are your policies in the office counterproductive to healing folks? You have to create some safe spaces for them to come forward and say, I need help, without the threat of, well, if trauma is affecting your performance, then we'll replace you with the next one who didn't come forward. You see, so it's going to take a collaboration between the staff and the leadership. The leadership should pass down to HR that we want our employees healed, and we want them to understand that their healing is important to our productivity here at work. I think if you start off there, you would help our cause and what we're trying to do to make Milwaukee the best place to live, work, and play.
I would say to Mike's question about how do you recognize trauma, I think just look at the behaviors of your employees. I mean, some of the things we talked about, I just want somebody that shows up every day on time. So why are people late? Why are people not showing up? Those are indicative of someone who probably has experienced trauma. You look at aggressive behavior, and I heard so much when I started this that we've got to work on anger management with these men and conflict resolution. Well, I think it's a lot deeper than that, and sometimes it is this trauma manifesting itself in their behavior. So that's one clue as to people that may have been exposed to trauma.
Our focus would generally be that you focus on workplace behaviors, not so much on the singular history of one specific employee, and to Frank's point, to make sure that the organization is trauma responsive in policies and procedures and treating everybody the way they ought to be treated, frankly.
Okay, now a number of you have worked with people, on the front lines, that have experienced trauma. Can any of you share any success stories of individuals that have been within your organizations that would inspire all of us?
I'll go with one. Is this really on? Maybe it's just not high enough. How is that? We have a gentleman by the name of Juan. I'll give you his last name because he's proud of what he's done, Juan Montez. And Juan was in prison 4 times and is sentenced to 55 years in prison. He served 23, and on his last visit, he was talking to the prison shrink, and the prison shrink said, "Juan, do you know why you do what you do? Why do you act out this way?" He said, "I actually have no idea why I do this." And the shrink said, "Well, you were abused when you were younger, badly, and so he helped Juan to connect the dots in his life, and that's kind of the first step." Juan said, both my parents are in prison, both of my grandparents on both sides are in prison, and all of my siblings are in prison. He said, "I never had any doubt that I was headed to prison, I just didn't know for what and when." So he came out of prison now having an idea or some context around this. He came to work for us, and today Juan is a crew chief at a large manufacturing company, and he has 6 people reporting to him. And so he uses systems and procedure or practices that we teach our crew chiefs, and he's very effective, and he loves his job. And so that's an example.
I'd say for us, I measured success as taking someone who was living in poverty to is no longer in poverty. That's what our measurement is. And in 6.5 years of doing this, I've learned that it's a very long journey to do that. And there's a lot of success that comes along the way that doesn't automatically end up with someone being out of poverty. And I can speak to one young man that was very early on in our program, a young African-American gentleman who had tattoos across his face and had 4 big permanent gold teeth. And we do a workshop to start our program, and one of the things we're trying to do is to treat everybody with dignity and respect. No one is a poor person in our program. Everybody has value. And this gentleman said at the end of our 2-week workshop, he said, "You're the first people that saw me." And we said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" "Well, people see this, and they immediately think they know who I am. I'm a gang member, I'm violent, I'm a drug-addicted person." And that was a big step for us. And so he started working at one of our stability employers that we have, and 3 weeks into that role, his brother is murdered in a drive-by shooting on his front porch right in front of him. And he called us that very same day, and we said, what are you going to do? And he said, "I know what I want to do. I know who did this. I want to go back on the streets and get revenge." But he said, "I know that's not who I am anymore. And as hard as it is for me, I'm going to let it go. And I'm going to let the police do or not do what they do. And I'm going to keep my journey towards what I want to become." And he is not economically self-sufficient yet, but for 4 years he's been working with us, and he stumbles and he goes away and he comes back and he's better than he was before. And it's a journey that he's got deep, deep-seated trauma that he's been involved in that he's trying to overcome, not only growing up, but then this exposure to violence in his adulthood. But I know if it weren't for what we're doing, he'd either be dead or be in prison for the rest of his life. So I consider that to be a success of our program.
Mike, I wonder if I could tell a slightly different story. Sports saved my life, without a doubt. And so my give back to this community is I coach a little inner city track team called the Milwaukee Mustangs. So in my philosophy of coaching is get to know the athletes I coach. And one day we have a young lady who's a nationally ranked sprinter. In the middle of summer, she comes to practice in a long sleeve t-shirt.
And I thought, what's wrong with, what's going on here? And she's been in this club about 5 years before I even joined the program. So I pulled her aside and I said, what's with the long sleeve t-shirt? And she said, I just like to wear it in the summer. I said, okay. Pull up that shirt, let me take a look and see what's going on. And there were cuts from that child's wrist to her elbow. Now, the reason why I tell you that story is that child is one of your employees in 10 years. What kind of employee is that child going to be? If as a coach, I don't intercept that child and solve that problem at 13 when you get her at 23. You see, so this is much bigger than some of what's going on here. They go way back, these stories. And so we got to get involved in the entire family, not just the one that you giving a paycheck to. Because if we don't do this, we have an economic and a security risk facing our city that's beyond anything that you could think of. So I can't emphasize enough to all of you that this thing runs really, really, really deep. And it takes all of us, with all of these stories, to fix our town.
So we've really been talking now about helping people heal to this point. I want to take a step back and maybe get kind of where you just were heading, Frank, thinking about prevention. You know, what can we do to limit the amount of trauma that individuals within our community face? And, you know, as I think about the power of this group in this room today, what could we as a group, the GMC, do to help address some of those issues?
There's a term called the abundant community. It's, I believe, based on a book written by McKnight. I forgot the first name. I gave it to you. You didn't read it, John McKnight. And it says that every community has a tremendous amount of assets that can be brought to bear on a problem. You have companies, you might have a hospital, you might have a prison, you have the healthcare system, many assets in a community and a neighborhood, really. You also have naturally occurring associations. You have people that love to get together for a specific reason. It's something they love to do. They play bridge, they play softball, they're business owners and they're in Rotary or something like that. And then you also have people in your communities that are great connectors. They just love saying, you're a junior in high school. What's going on with you? Where are you headed? And so that person would say, okay, you know, have you met, there's Dan Johnson over there. He's at Wisconsin Lutheran College. You should meet his people because maybe there's a place for you there. Or so assets, naturally occurring associations, and connectors. So for those that have or that run or own businesses in your community, all around you are all the resources required to help the families in those communities get what they need. It requires some work to bring those groups together, and all of a sudden we have, and I wrote something really clever. If I can find it, you're just going to love this. But really, I didn't find it. But what happens is that schools get students, businesses get employees, deserving people get jobs. All of the needs get met if we bring these resources together and just organize instead of act like everything's a different silo, or in silos, yeah.
I'd say there's lots of things that we could do to try to prevent this problem, and I think I'm just going to focus on what we do, which is trying to reduce poverty in our city. I mean, it's a known fact that children born into poverty are going to be exposed to these traumatic events. They're most likely going to end up staying in poverty. So what can we do to take this group of people that are currently chronically unemployed and been living in generational poverty? And that's the problem we're trying to address. And I think the biggest problem in Milwaukee is that, but it's also a huge opportunity, because I'd say for most of you in the audience today, the biggest problem you as a business are facing is I can't find workers right now. I can't find workers that show up every day. If you look at unemployment in the city of Milwaukee, it's about 5% right now, which equates to about 14,000 people. The Brookings Institute did a study a few years ago that looked at a number of cities across the country, and they estimated that in the city of Milwaukee, there are over 45,000 adults between 25 and 64 that are currently not working, compared to 14,000 that are in the unemployment number. Most of those people are chronically unemployed people. They've never held a job for any length of time. They have significant barriers that are standing in their way of long-term success, including trauma probably being the deepest seated problem that's the cause of all the other things. So if together we can address the issues that those people and take them from living in a state of poverty to helping them be the kind of employees that you want, it's a great solution for you, and it's a great thing for Milwaukee. And I've seen evidence that when we have success through the dignity of work with people, they have children, they start to view their children differently than they did before they had dignity. And they start to want to value the education that their children have instead of not caring about the education that their people have. So I think by impacting the adults that are living in poverty today, it's going to help us with the problems of the future.
I think that I would ditto the breaking down the silos, and I think that SWIM is doing an incredible job of bringing together a very wide variety of organizations, public, private sector, companies, et cetera, to do that. I think that from a preventative measure, every single person in this room has an opportunity to increase their volunteerism, to encourage their employees to volunteer, and I think that mentoring and mentorship, talking about the 13-year-old that Frank just mentioned, Frank was that young lady's mentor as well as coach and caught her early. I think there's huge opportunity for all of us to invest in our kids, to help look at some of those early warning signs and provide that wraparound support that Frank mentioned.
David Brooks in The Second Mountain wrote that a community is a space where everybody has a role to play in making that place a very positive place to live. And I truly believe that. I believe we all have a role to play in making this city, regardless of where we are in the economic, race, education scale, to see to it that it achieves its fullest potential. And I think that's what SWIM is all about. If you look at the 8 action plans, what we're trying to do is to create a diversity of touch points, of entry points, for someone suffering from trauma to enter into the solution. And that might be the barbershop. Tell the barber if you're having a problem. It might be the sports field. It might be the teacher. It might be the pastor. Whomever it is, we're trying to create an ecosystem that gets so close to the problem that we don't believe we will miss anyone if we pull this off, or when, because we will. And I really believe that if you join this movement, we will accomplish this goal.
Going to wrap it up just with one last question before we allow questions and answers from the audience today. We think about the intersection. We heard about the science from Tim today, and we have here the corporate workforce represented with corporations. And then we think about the community. Where do you see all of this intersecting, or how do we make sure all of this intersects so that we do get to Frank, where we do get close enough to everyone? What do we need to do at this point?
Somebody else take a chance at it.
So I'm the board chair of an organization in the inner city called New Beginnings Are Possible. It's a faith-based program after school for kids 4 through 18. And so our goal is to help kids become family and career capable. Part of that is that we have to intercept them if they've been in trauma and or help them kind of live above their circumstances. Another thing is that we have to intercept them so that they can read by 3rd grade, because that's the highest indication of whether someone will go to prison. That is the scariest statistics I've ever heard in my life. Can't read by 3rd grade, the highest indicator of whether you go into prison or not. But New Beginnings is an awesome place because it's in a building called Agape. And there's room for other organizations. There's room for collaboration with businesses. Other services that provide wraparound care and help people get into work. So it's, again, I'm getting back to the same thing, but you talk about the barbershop thing. New Beginnings had a young man by the name of Elijah Carter. So Elijah came to us after being locked up. He worked for us, and if he was here, I would say the same thing. He was a horseshit worker. But he ended up being an awesome worker, a highly productive worker, but his goal was to become, to own his own barbershop. So ultimately, we helped him to do that. So now he speaks into the ears of kids about his experiences in life, and he doesn't want them to take that. So, and he's back at New Beginnings giving haircuts. So there are places where we have to meet and connect the dots, and we can do that. And I think the business community needs to get in on that because you're going to need some workers, and there can be some phenomenal workers.
If I can add, one of the things we haven't talked about is the connection with those who are affected by the trauma, the inclusion of them in the solution. SWIM is built from the bottom up. We need to stop doing things for people and start doing things with people, no matter where they are on this ladder. And I think the solution, one of the strongest solutions to this problem, is to give the traumatized the opportunity to speak. Give them the opportunity. We need to hear from them what they're going through. And when you do, you would be amazed that many of them have the solution. They just don't have the resources and the wherewithal to execute it. So, Mike, I think if, based on what we're working on and the great minds in this room, I think a combination of both, with the inclusion of the advocates and the grassroots folks out on the street, I think we can very well make this one of the greatest things to happen in the history of our town.
Well, I think we're at the time for the questions and answers. Let's first thank our panelists for the great. Okay, the floor's open. Elmer has the mic. Yeah.
Alicia, I guess this is for you. You talked a little bit about your company and how you implemented some of these principles within it. And you talked about a questionnaire that you disseminated, and then ultimately some interventions, a walking program, for example, that seemed to ameliorate the problem. Who helped you build those interventions? Was it in fact the person suffering from the trauma, or did you have some clinical expertise that came in and helped you sift through?
That's a great question. I think that we started with the people suffering from the trauma. We learned from our caregivers, who I said earlier, many of them had, higher than average ACE scores, what was most important to them, and we are starting to prioritize some of those things. And so working with St. A, some of those interventions have taken place before even our training has taken place, because it seemed like there were some easy kind of short-term wins that were worth piloting. And let me be really clear, like Capri has been amazing in terms of allowing us to pilot things. And we have not come up with, a fail-proof solution. In fact, this is, the training is, 2 days from now. And so, hopefully a year from now or 6 months from now, we'll have some better data, or at least a vibe in terms of how things are going. But there are some things that are repetitive in nature. Frank and I went through some sports training from a coaching perspective, and just tossing a ball back and forth can help regulate a person. And so when you're trying to diffuse some of the anger management issues that we were talking about earlier, being able to give some of our on-site managers those simple and they sound so simple. It's not always simple at the time, of course, but some of those simple strategies has been, we've seen some early, kind of successes, but we're not all the way there yet.
Mike, this is a question for you. Obviously, you're an educator. What are the roles of the primary education, secondary, college age? Because it seems if you had a way of intercepting early, can kids take the ACEs test as they're entering, the 8th grade or something like that?
So, and there are schools and places where students do take the ACE test before they enter, even at the pre-K level. And it's amazing in parts of the city how high their scores can be. So one of the things that, as an education system like Marquette's, and all the education systems here, we need to help make sure our teachers are trauma informed and understand what trauma looks like in the classroom, so they know, first of all, which students have experienced trauma before they even come into class that day, and then what can they do with simple things like breathing techniques or throwing the ball. You can actually transform from the back part of the brain to the front, so the student can actually learn in that day. And so part of it is looking at the curriculum we're teaching our teachers with. And the other thing is we found too in the education system is that there's a lot of secondary trauma amongst teachers. When they're dealing with students with trauma, there's actually many workforces that deal with people with trauma. So we need to make sure that they are having healing practices themselves, because burnout becomes so high in some of these fields because of the trauma. So, but yes, the answer to your question is we can start very, very early with children and start screening them, when they're 3-4 years old, and then appropriately take action to help them, hopefully transform and learn. So I think we have time for one more. I think there's one in the back here. Yeah.
Hi. Quick question about systems and the impact of those systems on trauma. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of work you're doing around that versus individuals?
Anybody want to answer it? Yeah. So I can take a first crack at it. So one of the things that one of the groups in the action teams that you saw was around policy. And one of the things that becomes very evident is there are a lot of policies in place in our state and in the city that maybe go against what we're trying to accomplish. And one of those being, it's very, very hard to get if you're a psychologist, to become a mental health for youth. They have to do an additional $2,000 unpaid to specialize in youth practice. That's a state level requirement. It's not even competency based. And so we have very few people that are willing to spend those extra 2,000 hours if they've been in school for 7, 8, 9 years to do so. So that's something very simple that we could potentially change, make it competency based, and allow more healthcare providers, particularly for youth, that allow us to move forward. Other thing, one thing we did not touch base on here today is one of the key issues we've uncovered as we found are things around race and segregation, and actually starting to work to change some of those things. I know, Frank is very, very passionate and talked about this a lot, that, that's the elephant in the room many times as we think about individuals who have experienced trauma. A lot of that has to do with some historical things that have happened in decisions that are made within our city. And so we're also trying to address that as best we can and build trust within our community. That's really the only way we're going to move forward. And I don't know if, Frank, you want to add anything, or Alicia? Go ahead.
Well, I think I'll add one thing, which is authored by the Corporate Engagement Committee of SWIM, which this is our mission statement. The training will give employers an understanding of how trauma, especially trauma caused by historic oppression, impacts both job seekers and employees. Based on this understanding, the training will offer resources to employers for improvements to policies and practices so as to boost levels of employee attraction, performance, and retention. And so we are so early in this, but again, on Wednesday, we will start to look at what some of those policies and processes might be.
Okay, I want to thank everybody in the audience for your attention today, and just want to go back to what I started with saying. I truly believe the reason why I'm spending my time and my effort on this is I believe that we will not reach our potential as a city unless we can start addressing the trauma that the individuals within our city face and help those that have had significant trauma heal. I do want to thank one more time our panelists for the great discussion. And bring Greg Marcus up to close us out.
Thank you, Mike and Tim Grove, and our panelists for your insights into trauma-informed care and long-lasting impact, the long-lasting impact it has on individuals. It's incredible work, really interesting stuff. You're leading the nation with your expertise and your commitment, so we're all very appreciative. The panel discussion, I thought, made the work relatable to the challenges we're all facing as business leaders in our workplaces. It got me thinking about, okay, because we have our workforce is very similar in how we're employing people who probably are facing a lot of these issues, so I thank you for that personally. Thanks to Mike and Amy for your dedication to SWIM and transforming our city. Keep an eye on your inbox because we're going to send you a brief survey about today's meeting. And not only will you get a survey, it's going to be extra bonus. We're going to include trauma-informed care resources. And we're going to have information on the October 30th event that, I'm not sure it was Mike or Tim, one of you talked about that event, that SWIM and MRA are hosting called Creating Workforce Resilience. The event will help you get a better understanding of the impact trauma and mental health has on your organization's success. Our next meeting is October 14th here at the University Club. The meeting is adjourned.